When Ava walked into the attorney's office, she thought she was simply attending the reading of her grandparents' will. But that meeting became the beginning of a war. Her wealthy grandparents had left their entire estate to her, not to their son, not to the relatives who expected luxury, and not to the family members who only appeared after the funeral. But here's the twist. They knew this would happen. Secret letters, security footage, private journals, and loyal witnesses were all waiting in the background. Ava was to just handed an inheritance. She was handed a battlefield and the truth about everyone around her.
My name is Lily. I'm 27. Just a month ago, I was a barista, living hand to mouth in a tiny studio. My grandparents pretty much raised me, not my parents. They were wealthy but lived simply, teaching me that integrity was worth more than money. After they died in a sudden awful accident, my world fell apart. Then, at their lawyer's office, I learned they left me everything, their entire $20 million estate. Immediately, family who never called them wanted a piece. But I refused to back down. If you want to see how money exposes people's true colors, stick around. And let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories on how family greed can get ugly. Growing up, my parents were technically there, but that was about it. My father, Mark, was a workaholic, always gunning for the next promotion, working 60-hour weeks. My mother, Claire, was more interested in her social life and charity events. We almost never ate dinner as a family, and when we did, they were glued to their phones for work or party planning. They gave me a house and food, but not much else. From the time I was 5, I spent every weekend and summer vacation with my grandparents, Arthur and Rose. Their simple 3-bedroom house was my safe haven. Despite having millions, their life was modest. On their few acres of land, Grandpa Arthur taught me how to grow tomatoes and corn in his vegetable garden. Grandma Rose showed me how to bake bread from scratch and mend my own clothes. They came to every school concert and awards night. My parents always seemed to forget. My grandparents built their fortune from absolutely nothing. They launched a small tool company in their garage back in the 70s with a single machine and a lot of grit. By the time I was born, Sterling Tools was a regional success with 2 large plants, but you would never know their net worth just by looking at them. My grandpa drove the same old Chevy pickup for 20 years. My grandma used grocery store coupons and only bought clothes if they were on sale. They always told me, money is a tool, Lily, not a trophy. Use it to build a meaningful life, not to show off for people you don't even care about. That mindset created a massive rift between them and my father. As their only child, he'd inherit everything and live like royalty. He hated their simple lifestyle, calling them cheap and old-fashioned. What he called deprivation, they called character building. They paid for his college, but they still made him get a summer job. After he graduated, they gave him a down payment for a small starter house, not the flashy downtown condo he wanted. But the real breaking point came when my father demanded to be made a vice president at their company. This despite having no experience. My grandparents told him no, saying he had to earn it like everyone else. He quit in a rage, took a job in finance, and their relationship was broken for good. With me, they were the complete opposite. They paid for all my schooling, so I graduated without any debt. They just encouraged me to find a job I was passionate about, not one that was just for a paycheck. So when I decided to become a barista, they were genuinely proud of me, even though my starting pay was barely enough to live on. Throughout my 20s, I was incredibly close to my grandparents. We had dinner together every single Sunday, without fail. I was their personal IT support, setting up their new tablets and showing them how to video chat. They taught me all their old family recipes and told me stories from their youth. On holidays, I always chose to be with them instead of my parents, which started huge fights with my mother. She saw it as a personal betrayal. I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment about a 30-minute drive from my grandparents' home. It was small, but it was mine, filled with thrift store furniture and a ton of plants. My salary from the coffee shop wasn't much, but I made it work. I found joy in simple things, like getting books from the library, hiking the trails at the state park, and volunteering at the local animal shelter. My grandparents respected my independent streak, though they'd sometimes give me practical gifts like a new set of snow tires or a nice espresso machine. A month ago, my whole world came crashing down. I was at home on a Tuesday night when the phone rang. It was the highway patrol. My grandparents were driving home when a drunk driver ran a red light, slamming into their car. They were killed instantly. The officer said they didn't suffer, but that was hardly a comfort. The funeral was a complete blur. I remember my parents taking over all the arrangements, arguing with the director about every single cost. My brother Sam flew in from out of town, but was on his phone the whole time. My Aunt Sophia put on an Oscar-worthy performance, sobbing when people were watching, but her tears dried up the moment they looked away. Uncle Ben just stood in the back, her silent shadow. None of them had bothered to visit my grandparents in years. But there they were, playing the role of the sad, devoted family. I just felt hollow. The only two people who had ever truly loved me were gone. Their house, once so full of warmth and laughter, felt cold and empty. I couldn't make myself go inside after the funeral. I just went back to my apartment, took a leave of absence from my job, and tried to handle the shock. 2 weeks after the service, I got a call from Mr. Gable, my grandparents' attorney. He said that I needed to come to his office with my parents, aunt, and uncle for the official reading of the will. I had no idea that meeting was about to show me who my family really was. The morning of the reading, it was cold and drizzling, which was a perfect match for my mood. I got to the law office 15 minutes, 15s early, wearing a simple black dress, carrying an umbrella my grandma made me keep in my car. The office was in a beautiful old brownstone that had been converted, full of dark wood walls and leather armchairs. Mr. Gable greeted me with a kind, firm handshake. He was in his late 60s, with gentle eyes and graying hair at the temples. My grandparents had always said he was more than a lawyer. He was a trusted friend they'd known for 30 years. "I am so deep sorry for your loss, Lily," he said softly. "Arthur and Rose were truly special people. I'll miss our chess game and her famous pecan pie during our meetings." His sincere words made my eyes sting with tears. "Thank you," I managed to get out. "They always spoke so highly of you." At that moment, the heavy front door burst open, and my family swept in like a storm. My father, Mark, came in first, scowling at his expensive watch. At 56, he looked like a colder, crueler version of my grandpa, completely missing his warmth. My mother, Claire, glided in after him, with a designer purse that likely cost more than my entire car. My 25-year-old brother, Sam, came next, wearing sunglasses indoors like some kind of celebrity. His idea of dressing up was a wrinkled polo shirt, messily tucked into his pants. Aunt Sophia, my dad's sister, trailed them, already complaining loudly into her phone about some problem at her tennis club. Uncle Ben snuck in last. He gave me a quick, worried nod before staring down at the floor. They'd been married for 2 decades, but I doubt I'd ever heard him say more than a dozen words. "All right, let's get this show on the road," my father said loudly, not even bothering to say hello. "Some of us have to run actual companies, mister." Gable put on a strained smile. "Of course, Mark. If everyone would please come with me to the conference room." The air in that room felt thick with greed as we all sat around a giant polished table. My father immediately took the chair at the head of the table as if he were a king. I sat near Mr. Gable, as far from my father as I could get. Everyone else just fell into their usual roles. My mother sat at my father's right hand, with Sam beside her, and Aunt Sophia and Uncle Ben sat directly opposite them. "Before we start, Mr. Gable began, I want to state for the record that Arthur and Rose were both of perfectly sound mind when they last updated this will 1 year ago. They were incredibly specific and clear about all of their intentions. My father just scoffed. Just get to it, Gable. We all know how this goes. My father built that company. I'm his son. It's just a formality, mister. Gable ignored him and opened a thick leather-bound folder. He put on his reading glasses and started. I, Arthur Sterling, and I, Rose Sterling, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be our last will and testament. The dry legal talk droned on for several minutes as Mr. Gable read through the standard clauses and appointments. My family was practically buzzing with anticipation. At last, he got to the part they were all there to hear. We hereby leave our entire estate, which includes, but is not limited to, all cash accounts totaling around $6 million. Our investment portfolio, valued at $10 million. All real estate holdings, including our primary home, valued at $3 million, and our remaining ownership in Sterling Tools, worth an estimated $1 million to our cherished granddaughter, Lily Ann Scott. The entire room went completely silent. I just stared, my heart hammering against my ribs. Sure, this was some horrible dream. Julian S. Lawyer continued. The agreement establishes a $50 million trust for his child with Isabel Renault. Therefore, it voids any previous provisions for the current marital estate with my wife, Clara, or our unborn child. My financial support during the marriage has been more than adequate, a position my legal team will vigorously defend. My father-in-law, Marcus, leaped up, almost knocking over his leather armchair. Let me see that, he demanded, yanking the tablet from the lawyer's grasp to scan the divorce terms. This is an outrage, my mother-in-law, Catherine hissed. $50 million to some tech opportunist. She liquidated within a year. My brother-in-law, Adrian, slammed his whiskey glass down on the table. What about my startup? I am supposed to be next in for funding fund. I need that capital for my platform. His wife, Chloe, gave me a look of pure poison. What did you do, Clara? How did you push him away like this? I was just paralyzed, completely hollow, as their words bounced around the cavernous living room. $50 million. My husband wasn't just leaving me, he was handing our entire future to someone else. The lawyer calmly took the tablet back from Marcus. If you could all please try to remain civil. There's more. Julian recorded a video message to explain his decision. He tapped the screen and the giant television behind a painting came to life. Julian appeared, seated in his penthouse office overlooking the glittering Miami skyline. My stomach clenched, seeing him there, looking just as he did this morning when he left for a last-minute investor summit. His recorded image began to speak. If you're seeing this, it means the divorce has been filed. I wanted to explain my choice thoroughly to avoid any misinterpretation. He looked right through the camera, right at me. Clara, I do still love you, but our ambitions are no longer aligned. For years, Julian S. voice filled the room. I've watched you dedicate yourself to your community gardens while my company was building the future. You've treated my life's work as a personal expense account, a way to fund your little projects, not as an empire for us to conquer together. He listed every gala ID skipped, every networking event ID dreaded, framing my social anxiety as a lack of support. The company I created, Julian said, was never about having a comfortable lifestyle. It says about leaving a mark, about shaping the next century. I built it through relentless focus and sacrifice. He paused. Isabel is the only one who truly understands that kind of drive. She challenges me. She gets the price of ambition. She isn't content with a quiet, small life, he went on. She flies to our offices in Dubai to close deals, not to go shopping. Her entire career is built on scaling in companies just like mine. I trust Isabel to be a real partner in this dynasty. She will leverage these resources to expand our vision, not just live comfortably on them. The video ran for several more minutes as Julian outlined his grand plans with Isabel, new international expansions, a joint foundation, their entire future meticulously planned. When the screen finally went dark, my father-in-law was furious. This is absolute garbage. She's manipulated him, it's obvious. We will fight this settlement with every resource we have. Julian's a lawyer, who had been waiting patiently, finally spoke. He predicted this response, Marcus. Julian underwent a complete psychological evaluation before filing, with 2 separate psychiatrists affirming his mental competence. He has also kept detailed journals for the last 5 years, documenting the growing chasm between his and Clara's life goals. I must advise you that challenging this divorce on those grounds will be extremely expensive, drawn out, and will undoubtedly damage the company's public image. My mother-in-law turned to me, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. Clara, dear, you know he doesn't really mean this. It is just a midlife crisis. That settlement money belongs in the family trust to protect the business. You'll sign it over to us, Wanyu, for the good of everyone. The room felt like it was closing in. They were all just staring at me. I need some time to think, I finally whispered. I didn't know any of this. Think about what? Adrian scoffed. That capital needs to be handled by someone who actually understands the market, he said, pointing at his own chest. As they started arguing, the lawyer discreetly touched my arm. You don't have to make any decisions today, Clara. Take as much time as you need. He handed me a thick leather portfolio. This contains the full settlement offer, the keys to a secure penthouse on Brickell Key, and contact details for your own legal and financial advisors. Please, don't hesitate to call me. The room devolved into chaos, with threats of lawsuits and accusations flying back and forth. Finally, the lawyer had to firmly insist that the meeting was over. As we were all leaving, Julian's father grabbed my arm. This is far from over, he seethed. You will be at our home for dinner this evening. 8 o'clock. Don't be late. It was a command, not an invitation. I simply nodded, too shocked to argue. As they piled into their matching black Escalades, I sat in my old, reliable hybrid in the guest parking area, clutching the portfolio. A life we had supposedly created together had just been weaponized against me. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, driving aimlessly over the Rickenbacker Causeway, finally pulling over at a quiet beach just to try and catch my breath. The portfolio sat on the passenger seat, a ticking bomb I was too scared to open. One part of me needed to see the price he put on our marriage. The other was terrified of the war it was about to start. At 10 to 8, I pulled through the massive gates of my in-laws' Coral Gables estate, seeing the other SUVs were already parked. Their massive mansion rose before me, a monument of cold glass and white stone designed to dominate, not to welcome. I took a single shake breath, grabbed the portfolio, and went inside. They were all waiting in the cavernous living room. A space so perfectly curated it felt more like a museum than a home. My father-in-law stood by a towering marble fireplace, swirling a glass of bourbon. My mother-in-law was arranged on a stark white sofa. Adrian was pacing, yelling into his phone, while his wife Chloe stared blankly at the polished marble floors. Finally, Marcus acknowledged me. Clara, sit. I chose the chair farthest from them, needing to keep an escape route clear. Let us discuss this rationally. He started, using the same tone he reserved for hostile takeovers. Julian is clearly having some sort of breakdown. His primary concern would have been to protect the family's assets, not to throw them away. My mother-in-law nodded. Darling, a sum of this magnitude is a burden. You're re-pregnant, you're re-emotional. Marcus is the only one with the expertise to manage this fund properly. You'll be taken care of course. We can get you a nice townhouse, something easier for you to handle. The condescension was meant to sting, but I refused to let it. My silence seemed to encourage him. Here is our offer. You will sign the full settlement into a trust which I, as the head of this family, will oversee. This protects everyone's future. You will get an annual stipend of 5%, which is more than generous for your modest needs. 5%. My voice was barely audible. That is still $2.5 million a year. Precisely, Adrian snapped, finally off his phone. Plenty for someone who pisses in the dirt. I need at least 10 million for my new decentralized media project. It's a sure thing. I stared at him. Adrian had torched a half-dozen sure things, his last failure being an AI-powered wine app that cost his parents 2 million before it imploded. And the penthouse in South Beach should really come to us, Chloe added, finally speaking. We have 2 children, and they need to be in the right social circles for their education. I almost laughed out loud. Chloe never visited our penthouse without complaining about the tourists. Her children, my niece and nephew, were practically strangers who sent us professionally printed holiday cards. As the night went on, their strategies changed. When the business like a pro hit a wall, they resorted to emotional blackmail. After all we have provided for you, my mother-in-law began, her eyes welling up. We welcomed you into this family, gave you a life you could only dream of. Is this how you thank us? I felt sick. Thank them. Not one of them had ever shown the slightest interest in my life, my work, or my passions. Then my father-in-law's voice went cold. We are not asking you, Clara. We are telling you what is happening. Either you sign the paperwork now, voluntarily, or we will contest the prenup. We will drag every private disagreement you and Julian ever had into a public courtroom. How many of his business trips did you refuse to attend? What did you complain about to your friends? I promise you, it will get very, very ugly for you. The threat hung in the air. I felt a wave of dizziness, but then, deep down, something shifted. I remembered what my own father told me when a developer tried to bully him into selling our family farm. Never let a wealthy man's anger make you feel small, Clara, he'd said. Just know your worth and stand your ground. My Uncle Robert, quiet all night, finally spoke up. Richard, maybe we should all just take a step back and let Ava process. This my father gave him a look that could curdle milk. This is a family matter, Robert. I am family, he answered quietly, but said no more under my father's glare. By 9, my brother Jason was already on his laptop, drafting transfer agreements. My mother was calling their lawyer, working out the exact legal phrasing. And my aunt was already looking up new condos, talking about which walls she'd knock down. They were carving up my inheritance before my very eyes. No one once mentioned what my grandparents would have wanted. They never asked me my thoughts on managing the estate. At 10:30, my dad slid a document and a pen across the table. Sign it, he demanded. I looked it over. The wording was slick, but it basically gave him complete control over everything. In return, I'd get an allowance that he would determine at a later date. I put the paper down and took a deep breath. The whole room went quiet. What was that? My dad asked, his voice dangerously low. I said, no, I will not sign this. My grandparents trusted me, and I intended to honor their final wishes. My mom started screaming about how ungrateful I was. My brother, Jason, called me names I won't repeat. My aunt began to cry about her children's financial future. But I just sat there, rigid, letting that single word, no, be my shield. Finally, my dad slammed his hand on the table. Enough, he roared. I told your grandfather you were too soft. You manipulated them. And now you're trying to manipulate us with this little innocent act. He leaned over the table, his finger pointed right at me. You have a choice to make, Ava. Right now, you either sign that paper and remain a part of this family, or you walk out that door with your precious money and you are disowned. You don't get both. The ultimatum hung in the air. I looked from face to face, searching for just a single ounce of compassion, of actual family. I found none, and that's when I realized it. I was never family. I was just the key to their fortune. I'm not signing, I said, finally standing up. I'm sorry you see it's this way, but I have to do what Grandma and Grandpa asked of me. Then get out of my house, my father snarled. Pack a bag. I want you gone by midnight. I have my own apartment, I reminded him calmly. I haven't lived here in years. He let out a cold, empty laugh. The apartment we coexist on Because your little art gallery doesn't pay? Check the lease, sweetheart. One of my shell corporations owns the building. Consider your lease terminated. My stomach twisted into a knot. He was right. I couldn't get approved a loan, so they had helped. I never knew they owned it. You have 30s, my mom said, glancing down at her designer watch. The locks get changed tomorrow morning. I stood there, frozen. They were actually making me homeless over money that wasn't even theirs. Clock is ticking, Jason smirked. Better hurry up. All those millions can't buy you a place to sleep tonight. Packing my entire life into a couple of bags was a total blur. I was just on autopilot, grabbing whatever was in reach. How does money turn people into these kinds of monsters? My dad stood in the doorway of my old room, arms crossed, watching me like a guard. While I packed, I could hear my mother downstairs, on the phone with a realtor, already making plans to sell my grandparents' house. You were never one of us anyway, my dad said, his voice completely flat. Your mother and I were getting a divorce. Then we found out she was pregnant with you. You were the only reason we ever stayed together. The words were so casual, so unbelievably cruel. It felt like a physical blow. I always felt like the odd one out, but to hear him confirm it, then my mother appeared. We wasted enough money on you, she said. Private school, that trip to Italy, all the art supplies you wasted. Consider our investment a complete loss, she added. An investment, not their daughter, just a bad stock pick. Jason leaned against the doorframe, smirking. You regret this when you re-alone, he said. That inheritance will dry up eventually. And when you come begging, we'd remember how you chose money over us. I zipped up my last suitcase, trying to blink back the tears. I would not let them see me break. Is that everything? My dad barked. I looked around my childhood bedroom. I only ever stayed here for holidays now, but it was still my room. My awards, my diploma, photo albums, all my books, my entire history was in here. I can come back for the rest later, I mumbled. My father just laughed. There is no later. Anything you leave behind tonight goes into a dumpster tomorrow. Your choice. The cruelty was breathtaking. They were literally erasing me from their lives. All because I wouldn't give them a fortune they didn't earn. I grabbed my grandma's quilt off the bed and shoved it in my bag. I wasn't leaving that. Then, with my bags digging into my shoulders, I walked downstairs. Nobody moved to help. At the front door, I risked one final look back at them. They were all standing there in the entryway like a firing squad, their faces a mix of rage and satisfaction. You have the money now, my mom said. But one day you learn that family is priceless. You'll regret this. I'm not the one throwing away family, I said, my voice barely a whisper. You are. Then I walked out door and into the night. As it slammed shut behind me, the reality crashed down. I was homeless. My family had disowned me. In one night, I had become both a millionaire and an orphan. Sitting in my car, the dam finally broke. Tears just streamed down my face in huge, gut-wrenching sobs that shook my whole body. I cried for my grandparents, for their kindness that I miss so much. I cried for the family that I always wanted but clearly never had. And I cried for myself because I was now completely and utterly alone. After what felt like hours, I wiped my tears and started the car. But where was I supposed to go? I couldn't check into a hotel like this, and I couldn't bring myself to call a friend and try to explain this nightmare. Then I remembered the envelope the lawyer had given me. Inside was a set of keys on a little brass owl keychain that my grandpa always used. They were the keys to my grandparents' house. A house that I suddenly realized was now mine. The drive across town felt surreal. Every block was a strange mix of relief and crushing sadness I was going home. But they wouldn't be there to greet me. I hadn't been back since the funeral. It was too painful. The porch light was on, set by a timer my grandpa had installed. I sat in my car for a minute, then finally grabbed a bag and walked to the door, the key trembling in my hand. The house smelled exactly as I remembered it, like Grandma's rose potpourri, and the lemon polish Grandpa used every Sunday. I switched on the lights, almost expecting to hear their voices from the living room. But the silence was heavy and absolute. I went to the guest room, which had always been my room, and dropped my bag. It was untouched. The book I'd been reading was still on the nightstand, with my bookmark in place. My grandma had left a fresh stack of towels on the chair for me, ready for my next visit. That simple, loving gesture, that hope for her visit that would never happen, shattered my heart into a million pieces. I collapsed onto the bed and cried until I fell asleep, still in my clothes. When I woke up, the sun was streaming in. For just a second, I thought I smelled coffee brewing and heard my grandpa whistling. Then the silence returned, and the reality of it all came crashing back. They were gone, and I had inherited not just their fortune, but also their enemies, my own family. My phone had been buzzing all night with messages from my parents. They were a bizarre mix of threats and fake apologies. "We can still fix this, Ava, if you'll just be reasonable." My dad's text was more direct. "You have 24 hours before we file a lawsuit to contest the will." Jason's was just cruel. "Enjoy the big empty house. You won't be in it for long." That last one sent a genuine chill down my spine. I forwarded it to my lawyer, Matthew, who responded instantly. "Stay inside. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Do not open the door for anyone." His urgent tone was frightening, but it was also a relief. Someone was on my side. He arrived exactly on time, holding a briefcase and 2 large coffees. I led him to the kitchen, and we sat at the small table where my grandparents always had their breakfast. "All right, first things first," he said, sliding one of the coffees to me. "Your family has already contacted 3 law firms to challenge the will." I knew they would, and I'm ready for them. I told him about being evicted, that my dad's cess company owned my apartment building. Matthew just nodded grimly. "That S. Richard for you. But what he doesn't realize is your grandparents were always one step ahead." He pulled a document from his briefcase. They anticipated this. He handed me the deed to a small cottage outside the city. "Your grandmother bought this 5 years ago and put it in a private trust just for you. Marcus has no idea it exists. You have a safe place to go." A huge wave of relief hit me, knowing I wasn't going to be homeless. Still, the idea of hiding out while my family circled like sharks just felt wrong. "And there's Esmore, Mr." Coleman continued. "You are not fighting this battle alone. Your grandparents had many law friends who knew exactly what your family was capable of." Right then, there was a quiet knock on the guest house door. "Mr." Coleman smiled. "That should be Frank." "Frank!" The name sounded familiar. "Frank Miller, Mr." Coleman clarified. "He was your grandparents' groundskeeper and handyman for the last 20 years. He looks after the guest house." The door opened to a man in his late 50s with kind eyes and graying hair, holding his cap in his hands. "Miss Olivia," he said softly, "I'm so sorry for your loss. Your grandparents were wonderful people. I saw your car and just wanted to see if you were all right." His simple decency almost brought me to tears again. "Thank you, Frank. Honestly, this is all just so much." Frank nodded. "Mr. Walter and Mrs. June knew it would be. They asked me to keep an eye out for you. The house and grounds are all taken care of. I've been watching over everything." "Mr. Shaw!" Coleman waved Frank over to join us. For the next hour, Frank told me stories I had never heard about my grandparents, painting a picture of 2 people who were deeply loved by all their staff. "Your father and brother," Frank said, choosing his words carefully. "They showed up right after the funeral, when the house was empty. They took things: antique pens, rare books, some new laptops. I have it all on the security footage." My blood ran cold. My father had installed a huge security system for them years ago, supposedly for their own safety. I completely forgot about the cameras. Frank just shook his head. "They didn't know, Mr. Harrison had me put in a new system last year. He didn't trust the one your father set up." said it had too many blind spots. Mr. Coleman wrote that down. That footage is gold if they decide to sue. There's more, Frank added. Mrs. June kept journals. She wrote down everything, especially what happened during family visits. They're in the library. I followed him to the library, where shelves were lined with dated, leather-bound journals. Frank pulled a volume from the shelf and passed it to me.
This one is from when your father asked for money last spring,
He said, for that big condo development. I opened it and recognized my grandmother's elegant script. May 15th. Marcus visited today, the first time in 6 months. He didn't ask how we were. He went straight into a pitch for a real estate deal that needed $250,000. When Walter refused, Marcus got nasty, accusing us of favoring Olivia. He said we were fools to trust her, that she only visited to get her inheritance. He couldn't be more wrong. Olivia never asks for a dime. She has no idea what we're actually worth. She brings us flowers from the garden every Sunday and just stays to read with us. Marcus stormed out before his coffee was cold, leaving Walter deeply unsettled. I kept reading. Page after page, year after year, it was the same old story. My father demanding cash. My brother Ethan with some new ridiculous business idea. My mother complaining their beautiful home was a social embarrassment. But my visits were described with such love. My grandmother wrote about the books we discussed, our long talks, and the small tech problems I'd fix for them around the house. She saw a part of me my own parents always ignored. While I was reading, the doorbell rang. Frank answered, returning with an older woman in a pressed floral dress. "This is Clara Jenkins," he said. "She was your grandparents' housekeeper for over 20 years. Clara pulled me into a big hug. "You look just like June when she was your age," she said, her eyes welling up with pride. Over the next few hours, more people arrived. Miss Adler, my grandparents' chief accountant for their publishing house, offered to review the financials with me. David Chen, their financial planner, brought binders that detailed my entire trust fund. Susan Miller, their neighbor of 30 years, showed up with a casserole and stories about neighborhood barbecues I went to as a kid. Every single one of them brought not just information, but genuine affection. They all adored my grandparents, and because of that, they were here to protect me. While helping me in my grandmother's office, Clara found a hidden safe. Inside were letters from my father going back decades. Every single one was asking for a loan, and some even threatened to keep me away from them if they refused to pay. She also found a flash drive with security footage from the day of the funeral. Your mother went through June's jewelry box before service was even over. She pocketed several heirlooms, claiming June would have wanted her to have them. It was clear my grandparents had been preparing for this war for years. They hadn't just left me an inheritance, they left me an army and all the ammunition I would ever need. Around 4, while Mr. Coleman was explaining a document, my phone buzzed. A text from my brother Ethan. "Enjoy the mansion while you can. Mom, Dad, and the others are coming at 10 a.m. tomorrow to claim what's ours. Stay out of the way, or this will get ugly." I showed the screen to Mr. Coleman. His jaw tightened. "That is a direct threat, and it suggests they plan to force their way in," he said quietly. "I think it's time we implement the final stage of your grandparents' plan." He made 2 quick phone calls, speaking in low tones about protocols and evidence. When he hung up, he looked right at me, his eyes serious. "They knew this would happen, Olivia. They knew Marcus and the others would never accept the will, so they prepared for battle. Tomorrow morning, we will be ready for them. But tonight, I want you to look over all of this, so you know exactly what you're fighting for." He pointed to the dining room table, now covered in journals, bank statements, and legal files. "Your grandparents, something more valuable than money. They built a community on a foundation of loyalty and respect. That is their real legacy to you. After everyone but Frank had left for that night, promising to return in the morning, a strange calm settled over me. I finally realized I wasn't going through this alone. My grandparents had passed down not just their estate, but their wisdom and their entire network of friends. I spent that night reading through journals and financial records, seeing my grandparents in a whole new way. They were brilliant, careful, and always one step ahead. Every move they made was to protect what they built and to protect their heir. For the first time since the will was read, I felt like I could handle the weight of what they'd left me. I refused to let them down. As I got ready to go to bed, another text from my brother Ethan lit up my phone. Better sleep with one eye open. Tomorrow you'll learn what happens when you steal from this family. Instead of fear, a cold sense of purpose washed over me. Tomorrow would definitely show the consequences of stealing from family, just not in the way Ethan imagined. I woke up early, feeling anxious but determined. By 8 a.m., our lawyer, Mr. Coleman, arrived with coffee, pastries, and a thick legal binder. These are restraining orders, all ready to be filed if we need them, he said, and cease and desist letters addressing Ethan's threats. The private chef, Marco, came in right after, heading straight for the kitchen. The warm smell of coffee and croissants filled the house, a strange sense of peace before the storm. By 9:30, the house was full of allies. Marco stood near the front door, a quiet, solid presence. Miss Adler, my grandparents' accountant, had her laptop open at the dining table, ready to project the financial records. Marco made sure we all had fresh coffee. His calm energy was a tribute to my grandparents' character. At 9:45, headlights cut across the lawn as cars pulled into the long drive. First, my father's sleek black luxury sedan, followed by my mother's enormous white SUV. Then my Aunt Cynthia and Uncle Mark in their flashy red convertible, a tacky monument to their midlife crisis. Finally, Ethan's roaring, obnoxious sports car, which he could only afford because my parents paid for it. "They're early, mister," Coleman noted, trying to catch us unprepared. The doorbell rang, sharp and insistent, followed immediately by heavy knocking. "Mister." Coleman gave Marco a nod, who then opened the door. My father stood there, stunned for a moment to see a stranger. Behind him, my family crowded together, their faces a mix of fury and smug confidence. "Where's Olivia?" my father demanded. "This is a private family discussion." Marco held his ground. "Miss Harrison is expecting you. Please, come inside." My family stormed into the foyer, then stopped cold when they saw the group waiting for them in the living room. I stood in the center of the room with Mr. Coleman just behind me. "What is this?" my mother snapped, her voice shaking with rage. "You've brought strangers into a private family matter." Before I could answer, the front door opened one more time, and two more people walked in. The first was Judge Eleanor Vance, a formidable woman in her 70s and a close friend of my grandparents. She was followed by Jessica Reed, a local journalist whose college education was funded by my grandparents' foundation. My father's face went white when he saw Judge Vance. The judge had ruled against him in a nasty business dispute years ago, a lawsuit my father had tried and failed to influence with his family name. "Eleanor," he stammered, faking a cheerful voice that sounded completely hollow. "What in the world are you doing here?" The judge's expression was made of stone. "I am here at the express written request of Walter and June Harrison, represented by their lawyer, Mr. Coleman. They ask that I serve as an impartial observer to any family disagreements regarding their estate in the event of their deaths." My mother glared at Sarah Jenkins. "This is absurd. We're here for family heirlooms that are rightfully ours. Why is the press here?" The reporter offered a tight smile. "I'm just a family friend, not here in any official capacity unless a crime is committed. Then my professional duties would have to kick in." The threat was crystal clear. As if on cue, the back door opened and 6 more people thinned, forming a protective half-circle behind me. They were the most loyal employees from my grandparents' company, people who knew my uncle since he was a kid and saw him become a man who was never there. You cannot be serious, Leo sneered. You think these people are going to frighten us? I took a step forward, my courage growing with them behind me. I know exactly why you are here. You believe you're entitled to my grandparents' estate, no matter what their will dictates. You assume you can bully me into giving you everything you want. My uncle's face became a mask of stone. Those old fools were senile. We are only here to correct their obvious mistake. From behind me, Mrs. Gable's voice cut in sharply. Actually, Richard, we have a record of every time you tried to get money from your parents for the last 20 years. She opened a binder, including the unauthorized withdrawal from their retirement account in 2016, the forged check in 2018, and your attempt to have Eleanor declared incompetent last year after she refused to fund Leo's little crypto fantasy. My Uncle S.'s face turned a sickly shade of gray. That is all completely out of context. Marco stepped forward next, holding a tablet. I also have the paperwork for the company loan you conveniently forgot to repay, Richard. $200,000 from 2012 for that ski condo in Aspen. Your parents never pursued you for it, but they could have. One by one, my grandparents' oldest friends laid out the evidence of my family's financial attacks, contrasted with the fact they were never there for them in person. Aunt Cynthia was silently fuming, finally turned on me. You ungrateful little witch. You twisted their minds against us with your lies. Judge Albright cleared her throat. In fact, Mrs. Wallace, I have read Eleanor's personal diaries. There was no influence from anyone else. Your parents were very clear about their reasons. This is all so dramatic, my mother said, waving her hand. But it changes nothing. We will contest this will, and we will win, Mr. Davies stepped forward. I've brought some documents for you all. He handed a thick envelope to each of my relatives. It is a file of evidence that becomes public record the moment you contest the will. It contains bank statements, private messages, emails, and video recordings of your conversations with Arthur and Eleanor over the last 10 years. I would highly recommend you review it before you make any legal decisions. Uncle Mark, silent until now, tore his envelope open to read. His face grew paler with each sentence. After a moment, he put a hand on my Aunt Cynthia's arm. We need to leave, he whispered. This is not a fight we can possibly win. She furiously slapped his hand away. My brother is not a quitter. My uncle, however, was paralyzed, staring at the papers he held. It was a record of shady business deals he had tried to bury, along with transcripts of terrible things he had said about his own parents when he thought no one was listening. Sarah Jenkins spoke again. I should also say that the estate is now under 24-hour surveillance. Any attempt to remove property without express permission will be treated as theft. Marco nodded. The new security system records everything, is inside and out, and all footage is securely backed up in the cloud. While my family was processing that, I walked to a small table and picked up a stack of papers Mr. Davies had prepared. These are cease and desist orders for the threats you have been making, I said, handing them directly to Leo. I continued handing out papers to my uncle, saying, These are formal notices that I know what you removed from this house after the funeral, and I expect every item back. My mother began to protest, but I just talked right over her. And these, I said, giving her the final stack of documents, are the conditions for any future relationship I am willing to consider with you. It begins with you honoring my grandparents' last wishes and ends all attempts to challenge their will. The room was completely silent as my family finally understood the situation. My grandparents hadn't just legally secured their legacy, they had dominated Kenneth and blocked every possible move my family could make. The community they built was standing right there with me. My uncle was the first to speak. This is not over, he blustered. But his voice had no conviction. Actually, Richard, it is, Judge Albright corrected. Your parents were incredibly thorough. Any court in this state would honor their wishes is based on the mountain of evidence they compiled. One by one, my family began retreating toward the door, their threats dissolving against a solid wall of truth. Leo shot me a look of pure venom as he passed. This isn't the end, he hissed. Maybe not, I replied, my voice steady. But it is the end of you taking advantage of this family. My grandparents saw you for who you are. That is why we are all here. As they left for their cars, the tension in the room finally broke. Dorothy immediately began pouring coffee and passing scones, trying to clear the bitter feeling from the air. Everyone was congratulating me, but I felt nothing, just empty, caught between winning a fortune and losing my entire family. I did what my grandparents wanted, but I had to tear my family apart to honor their wishes. The victory felt hollow. Judge Miller must have noticed the conflict on my face. He rested a hand on my shoulder. Your grandparents would be proud, Chloe, not just for winning, but for how you handled it all. Sophia chimed in. You're more like them than you know. It's exactly why they trusted you. Watching my family cars pull away, I knew a chapter of my life had closed for good. The family I grew up with was gone, but in its place was a community built on respect. That was the real inheritance my grandparents left me. It wasn't the family I was born into, but maybe it was the one I was meant to find. The next 6 months were a whirlwind of rebuilding and grieving. Those first weeks were just a brutal grind of legal papers, financial meetings, and the sharp pain of knowing my family put a price on me. They did reach out, but only for money, proving that absolutely nothing had changed. With Liam and my grandparents' original team, I created the Eleanor and Arthur Croft Education Fund, launching it with a $10 million endowment for local schools and underserved children. The foundation concentrated on art programs and trade skills, things my grandparents felt were often forgotten by society. And I returned to my jobs as a kindergarten teacher, which shocked everyone who assumed I would just quit after inheriting so much money. My classroom at Oakwood Elementary became an example of what is possible with good funding. I paid for new books, endless supplies, and the technology our school's budget could never afford. Every one of my students received a healthy snack every single day and a new winter coat if they needed one. These were small things for me to provide, but they meant the absolute world to them. With Sophia Martinez as my mentor, I began to learn the business of running Croft Industries. I didn't take on an executive title, but I ensured the company maintained my grandparents' values, like their employee profit-sharing plan and excellent retirement benefits. The business thrived, keeping more than 100 people in our community securely employed. My grandparents' house, which had once felt so cavernous and empty, slowly started to feel like my own home. I eventually moved into the master bedroom, though it took months before I didn't feel like a guest. With help from Marcus, I turned the massive unused basement into a community space for foundation meetings and local workshops. Clara still came to clean 3 times a week, completely refusing to retire no matter how often I told her she had earned a very long vacation. My family tried a few more times to get back into my life, and their motives were always painfully clear. My father called when his latest business went under, asking for a small loan. My mother called when she heard of my foundation, suddenly wanting a seat on the board. My brother Leo sent a text message when his startup collapsed, hoping I would provide some funding. Aunt Carol even called before Christmas, suggesting that families belong together, especially in a big, lovely house that's perfect for parties. And each and every time, I politely but firmly declined, reminding them of the boundaries I had established that day. I explained that I was open to a real relationship, but one built on love and respect, not on financial desperation. Not a single one of them was able to meet those simple conditions. So instead, I created new traditions with the chosen family my grandparents had given me. Sunday dinners became a weekly event at my house, with a revolving door of guests like Sophia, Liam, Marcus and his children, Clara and other friends. We celebrated holidays, we marked milestones, and we supported each other. It wasn't the family I was born into, but it was a family bound by true loyalty and unconditional love. On a crisp autumn morning, just like the day they died, I went to my grandparents' graves for the first time. I placed fresh lilies on the stone and sat on the bench, finally ready for a conversation I'd been avoiding. "I'm trying to protect what you built," I told the quiet air. "The family trust is already at work. They funded 3 medical school scholarships for local kids who never would have had the chance. Your old partners still share stories about you." A gentle wind rustles to the trees, sending golden leaves drifting down around me. My grandpa loved this kind of day. Perfect weather for a good book and hot cider. "I wish you could see this," I said. "I still have so many questions for you. About the business. About everyone you helped. But I'm figuring it out." A few months ago, I found your old leather journal. It was filled with all your secret donations. Down payments for young couples, rent for struggling families, startup funds for small local businesses. You did it all anonymously, never wanting any credit for it. "Thank you for believing in me," I whispered. "I think I finally get it. It was never about the money. Not really. It was about a code using what you have to build up a community, not just to buy influence or put your name on a building." Sitting there, memories came rushing back, and the grief started to feel more like gratitude. I remembered Grandpa showing me blueprints, explaining how a neighborhood has a soul. I remembered Grandma teaching me about art and color. They came to every single one of my gallery openings, while my own parents were always busy traveling. The real inheritance wasn't a stock portfolio. It was their vision and integrity. The very next day, I hosted the Trust's first big events, a ceremony giving grants to 10 local entrepreneurs. Watching these driven, brilliant people get the funding to make their dreams real, I could feel my grandparents there with me. One of the recipients was a young woman named Maya Singh. She reminded me of myself from years ago, full of big ideas but with very few resources. She was launching a coding school for kids in poor neighborhoods. After the ceremony, Maya came up to me, her eyes shining. "My parents came to this country with nothing," she told me. "They worked in restaurants, just so I could have a shot. No one in my family has ever owned a business before. This grant changes our entire world. My younger cousins see me and now they believe it's possible for them too." In that moment, everything clicked. I finally saw what my grandparents were building. It wasn't a real estate empire. It was a legacy of opportunity. Their kindness created waves of change. The inheritance mess had shown me my family's true colors, but it also revealed a network of good people who respected my grandparents' character, not just their bank account. That was the true inheritance, worth more than any amount of money. So I keep going. I still take design projects, I manage the trust, and I'm slowly learning the family business. The money is a tool for good, but it's not who I am. I still live a simple life, drive my old car, and mentor young artists on the weekends instead of going on shopping sprees. I think they'd be proud of that. They always said money is a tool, not the goal. And now I understand. What about you? Ever face family jealousy over an inheritance? I'd love to hear your story in the comments. If this story meant something to you, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who might be facing a tough choice. Just remember, a real family is built on love and support, not on what you can get from each other. Thanks for listening to my story. I hope it inspires you to trust your own moral compass, no matter what challenges you face.